Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to The Reason We Learn. I'm your host, Deb Philman, and I have a great show for you today. Before I get started and introduce my guests, I would like to ask you to please consider liking this video and sharing it so others who are interested in the topic can join us in the chat. That is where you'll be able to ask questions of our guests or of me. Of course, this will be replayed immediately after the fact, but if you have a question, this is where you want to be. Also, please consider subscribing to the channel if you're interested in topics around education in America today. I cover that topic here on the channel, and your support is valuable. I also have a locals community where we can discuss these things in more detail, and you will never be censored at thereasonwelearn.locals.com, where I host a Zoom call every Wednesday evening. So without further ado, let's get to the show. Today, we're talking about literature in the classroom and fiction. And I have with me three guests. I have Elizabeth Kantor, who is an author. She wrote The Politically Incorrect Guide to English and American Literature and the Jane Austen Guide to Happily Ever After. She holds a master's degree in philosophy from the Catholic University of America and a Ph.D. in English from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So she'll be talking to us about what she witnessed there and why this might be happening and what she thinks about that. I also have with me Beanie, I'm probably going to say right, Gohegan?
Close. Good. Gohegan. Yes.
Okay. And she is the Kentucky chapter head of No Left Turn in Education, and also an elementary education and K-12 special ed specialist. She's the chief research officer at No Left Turn. And you were also a fifth grade teacher. Is that correct?
I did teach fourth and fifth grade in the schools. I now volunteer and teach. It's basically a one-room schoolhouse civics course and a reading course. So.
Great. Okay. So we're getting, sort of also a special ed perspective and the perspective of someone who is doing research and covering this topic for No Left Turn. And then I have Jen Schwartz, who is writing currently in a different capacity, but has a background in English education. She's a former middle and high school English teacher who, after surviving postpartum depression, severe postpartum depression, founded one of the leading online support communities and story sharing hubs for women impacted by pregnancy and postpartum mental health issues. But she also has a master's in English education and spent several years teaching middle and high school English before becoming a mom. So we have different perspectives. And of course, you have me. I was an American studies major, so I focused on American literature. And I am a huge fan of the classics. I love to read, and I have tried to get my kids to read the classics. I don't know who or where I would be without them in my life. And it pains me greatly to see that our children are not being taught these books in the classroom. So my first question for my guests, and anyone can pick this up, is why is it important for kids to read the classics? Basic question. Why are we getting fired up about this topic at all? Anyone want to take that on? Anyone?
Well, it's several thousand years of wisdom about the human experience, and it just seems sort of ridiculous to cut ourselves off from all that and reinvent the wheel in every area of human life. Perhaps we don't just instinctually know everything without learning from other people.
Right.
I also think that we're just robbing the kids of critical pieces of history when we don't read literature that has been written, from ages ago, whether it's, To Kill a Mockingbird or Shakespeare, depending on the era. And I think what we're not giving these kids by doing this is when you teach these books in the classroom, you can study them, in the context of when they were written, but then also in the relevance they hold today. And so by not doing that, I think we're really depriving kids of critical analyzation skills that they need to be successful in life.
I would agree with that. Yeah.
Well, and there's a big push right now to teach accurate history, make sure we're teaching history. And this is part of our history. Some of it is fictional and made up, but there's a little bit of truth in every fiction. And of course, my favorite genre is historical fiction. And I read historical fiction to read about people who overcame horrible situations, how they got through that. And sometimes you walk away from that book just amazed and inspired and encouraged to go out and sort of slay your own dragons. And our young people today are lacking the ability to slay their dragons. They're sort of whimpering in corners, in some occasions.
Yeah. So. People kind of live by precedent, and it's a lot of good precedents. There's a great poem in the Shropshire Lad by A.E. Housman, who's an early 20th century poet, and it's a dialogue with somebody saying to the poet basically, why do you read poetry? Terence, this is stupid stuff. You eat your victuals well enough. Why are you reading all these depressing literature? And basically the speaker says, I experience painful things in literature. I read poetry about painful things to basically inoculate myself against the suffering of life, right? I'm kind of like exposing myself to dangers and grief and all that in the classics, sort of like strengthens me against it in real life. It's like the ancient Near Eastern king Mithridates, who was like an arsenic eater. He ate like small amounts of poison in order to basically preserve himself from being poisoned by someone, because he was in it, like people wanted to poison the king, right? And so when you can apparently make yourself immune to arsenic poisoning by getting you develop a tolerance for it, like for opioids or whatever. And so his idea is literature is basically arms you against the tragedies and disasters and wear and tear and shocks and arrows of ordinary life. And we do see that this generation that has not been exposed to ideas they disagree with or threatening situations in a kind of a manageable, fictional, literary way are really fragile about real life.
Well, and how would you
say too, and I know this from, teaching the civics course that I'm teaching to these kids, that I have anywhere from 9 to 17-year-olds, and we're reading through the Declaration of Independence right now. We're just going through line by line. And, there's, according to one study, like this generation is not as smart, for lack of a better word, as previous generations. And so it's like, okay, if we keep moving in that trajectory, before long, we're going to have a citizenry who can't read our founding documents, because as we read through the Declaration of Independence, and then we're going to move on to the Constitution. And, I know in our house, we've read some of the Federalist Papers and Silence Do-Good letters and things like that. You're not going to find writing like that. You're not going to train minds to think and be able to read and understand that type of writing with the fiction that's out there today. A couple of examples. I asked for parents to send me examples today. It's like, yeah, that isn't preparing kids to read our founding documents. So that's another level of it as well. It's just the language and the way that it's written. It's harder to read. Your brain has to work a little harder, and sometimes junk food for your brain is okay at the beach, but we need to be training our kids to really work when they're reading sometimes. I mean, sometimes it is work.
There's so many influences shortening people's attention spans at the moment. And really the only way to lengthen your attention span is to do some exercise with documents that are harder to grasp.
Right.
And
most of the books
I'm
sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, and fiction, and these texts they can be hard. I mean, I remember being in high school, and loving the To Kill a Mockingbird unit, and always really dreading poetry because it was hard, and Shakespeare was hard. But I think we are now kind of showing kids, well, if it's hard, that's okay. Let's give you a timeout, right? If it makes you feel, like you can't do it, right? And I think rather than that's basically what we're saying. These are challenging works. I remember in high school, reading, and basically the teacher would just open it up, and you would go around discussing themes of what was in the book, and you would debate, and sometimes you would agree with people. These are all skills. These are all things that we are not showing kids that are important. And we're basically, I mean, I hate to use the term snowflakes, but we're, in a way kind of raising a generation of snowflakes, in the sense that if they don't like something, or they feel something is hard, or maybe they can't fully relate to it, then it's either wrong or they shouldn't have to do it. And I just don't, I don't agree with any of that.
I think we're sending the message that things should be easier, that easier equals progress. I mean, I hate to say it, but that easy button thing makes me cringe.
Yeah.
And it because there is a message that we are sending kids. Sometimes it's explicit, not just implicit, that if you pick up a text and it's challenging or difficult for you, that's because old dead people wrote it, right? It's like, they didn't know how to do easy things, so they did it that way. And so now we have this, this formulaic struggle literature that they'll say, well, this is progress, or it has to have a point. Like, all the literature has to have an obvious in your face point. And that brings me to my next question. I've often heard the definition of classics as books that stand the test of time because the themes are universal and they connect us to our shared humanity. How would you define classics? In other words, not even if they were
I
took
like
place,
that definition. That works.
like even if it's Homer, right? So it's written thousands of years ago. We could read it today and say, I can take something from this. I can get something out of this as a human being. I don't need to have been, Greek or Trojan or whatever.
I gave that example the other day. I think I posted it or something like that. That I don't relate to Moby Dick because I'm white, and I don't relate to Hester Prynne because I'm a woman. Neither one of those individuals shares my contemporary situation at all, but you can relate to a certain part of their story, a certain part of their journey, no matter your station in life and your gender or anything like that. I mean,
because you're a human being.
Because you're a human being, and there's always some part of the struggle, or maybe you don't relate to Hester Prynne. Maybe you relate to one of the people in her village. It's who knows? But I think and we were just talking about Pride and Prejudice, and I loved that book because there were so many different characters in there that I could relate to on certain levels. Yeah, there were words I wanted to relate to, but it was so yeah. I think that there is that connected humanness of it, and you don't always have to. I think that that's one mistake that and I hate to say it like that, but like sometimes parents will only teach their kids to read because it teaches them a lesson. Like, we're only going to read to learn a lesson, and we're only going to, it's like, no, sit down and read with your kids to let them escape into this world that isn't theirs. It's like you teach them that reading can take them somewhere. Not just
language,
success, but
and language is beautiful too. I mean, if I read Victor Hugo, I'm getting lost in the language. I mean, there are whole passages in that book where nothing's really happening. I'm just getting a description of a priest's, dining table. Okay. Like his room. And I'm reading this and I'm just like, okay, wow. Or just describing this guy's personality, and you look at the word choice and how the words are strung together. And I don't think we are, not to say that every student is going to be fascinated by this. Some people will think it's great. Some people will be like, that's interesting, and move on. But I don't think you deprive all the students of the opportunity to learn that rhetoric matters, that the way we put the words together, the individual words we choose, the sentence structures that we use, they means something. The experience of it is similar to, when you look at a well done movie or eat a beautifully prepared meal. This is
beauty,
can be an Epicurean delight if you allow it to be, but we're not even teaching that.
But it's not just a pleasure it's not just a pleasure. Beauty is also a clue. It's like a sign of some meaning beyond just your day-to-day slog, right? I mean, it makes you look higher.
Yes.
Right. And I think the timelessness and the human experience is so important. And I think, and I would guess that one of the reasons why the classics are being, people are going after them too, is we've moved away from the idea of the human experience, because everybody has to identify as something, whereas we're all humans, right? And so if you can't see yourself in this book, or you can't see yourself in this book, Beanie, like you were saying, you might not relate to Hester Prynne, you know, or Moby Dick, but you still read it, you still feel something, you still learn something, it still challenges you. And it's, again, and also that idea, right, of something bigger than yourself, you know, that idea of this piece of art, this piece of writing. And I think the other thing too is that reading these texts, it's so connected to being able to write also.
Yes.
I think that, you know, and this goes back, I think, for a long time, but kids cannot write. They cannot write, whether it's creatively or analytically, a research paper, you know, whatever it is. I really, really think there's a huge connection between teaching these texts and teaching children how to write. And you need to be able to read and write and analyze and think for yourself and critique, and whether even in math or science, right, or social studies. So it's a huge disconnect when we're getting rid of these texts from the classroom in terms of that too.
Can I go back to the difference between the sort of the old idea that we can all as human beings relate to these classics, and the new idea that your identity is derived from your race or your gender or something like that, right?
Yep.
So I looked up this W.E. Du Bois quote that I love, which now, of course, my mouse is not behaving properly. Okay, so he is a kind of leftist Black American from the early 20th century, and he says he's making an argument for the classics. He says basically saying Shakespeare's not a racist, right? Like he's living in the height of the lynching era in America, and he is dealing with racists. And he says, I sit with Shakespeare, and he winces not. Across the color line, I move arm in arm with Balzac and Dumas, where smiling men and welcoming women glide in gilded halls. From out of the caves of evening that swing between the strong-limbed earth and the tracery of the stars, I summon Aristotle and Aurelius and what soul I will, and they all come graciously with no scorn or condescension. You know, so basically he's saying, and Malcolm X found the same thing, that the classics are basically a way out of the, you know, racial tensions and resentments and prejudice and privilege that people were living with, and to some extent still are living with. I mean, because, you know, there's never going to be 0% racist. There's always going to be some jerks, right? So, you know, those things are realities. They're never going to 100% go away. But, you know, like the classics is a where we can all meet as human beings.
Exactly. Yeah.
And and again, if a book has racial themes or overtones or, you know, any of that, then okay, have a discussion about it in the classroom, right? Look at it from the context of when it was written, you know, where maybe, you know, where times were very different and things were very different, and talk about it in terms of today. These are analytical discussions that you can have with the kids without just saying, oh, this has racial undertones, we're not going to teach it anymore because it hurts some people's feelings. You know, that's not the way to go.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. You know, Aristotle thought slavery wasn't race-based in his day, but he thought that some people were naturally slaves, right? And you know, well, I think it's very interesting what changed about the world that made people decide that that was wrong. Like, it's a very interesting how the ancients all took slavery for granted, and, you know, then, I mean, well, as I saw in a Johnny Cash Christmas special the other day, you know, after Christianity, as he said, the cry of the slave didn't mix well with the song of the angels. You know, eventually, the idea that we're all, you know, there's no difference between, I mean, that all human beings were, you know, equally valuable and loved by God and redeemed by Christ, made people uncomfortable with slavery over time. And then some of them started an abolition movement, and sure enough, you know, nobody thinks that's defensible anymore.
You know, there's another interesting point to reading the classics. There is a small portion of this current generation that believes that the life they're living right now is misery, is like this no other
Yes,
generation
thank
before
you.
them has ever experienced. The
Right.
oppression and the hardships and the struggle and all of this. And it's like, go read
Some Tom Hardy
and come back to me. Oh my goodness gracious. I mean,
although
misfortune, go read something.
It's so true. And I always like to, like, I think about it too. I'm Jewish, you know, and I remember reading Night in 9th grade. And I know it's still read in various places, but I think, like, as a Jewish person, and I have relatives who were Auschwitz survivors, you know, and, you know, so you talk about, you know, kids not, you know, thinking that their lives are so hard and they're so oppressed, and, you know, and getting rid of books that might be, you know, I hate the word triggering, but, you know, have difficult themes. I feel like you would be hard pressed to find a Jewish person want to get rid of books like that, because their education, and we want to remember, and we want to talk about these things because we don't want them to happen again, and we want life to be better, right? And I think that you can expand that to, you know, all different types of classics, whether in their racial themes or religious themes, anything like that.
And the nice thing about the classics is they're really just telling a story from that time period with those different elements involved. They're not giving their commentary on it. That's for the teacher and the students to comment on and to decide. You know, one of the issues in Pride and Prejudice is that women really basically had two choices. You know, I mean, this was what they were. And my daughter, she's very, very bright, very independent. She's 16. She wants a knight in shining armor. She's, you know, and so we're watching this, and I'm watching this with my daughter, who's could go be anything she wants to do. And she's kind of like, oh, that looks great. Like the chivalry and of course, the dresses and all that, you know, she like, there's not all of that looks bad to her. And so, I guess my opinion on it. I just, you know, it was like, this was what her takeaway was, that, yeah, it's really bad that of course, women at that time didn't have a lot of options. At the same time, was written by a woman a long time ago. And, you know, but then also the part of it that she misses, that, you know, a certain element of society there too. Let her decide that, you know, it's just like these other students, you present this information and, you know, what do you think? Do you think that was a good thing or not a good thing? Rather than some of these other books like Stamped or whatever, that this is the way it is. And this is what you should think about it. And there is no arguing, because if you argue, then you're a racist. And, you know,
I think that's the difference between literature and propaganda, right?
Yes.
I mean, propaganda, the author author determines there's only one reaction you can have to it. Either you buy it or you don't, right? Whereas in literature, you know, the creator of the work is like creates real characters, and there's even the risk that the reader will side with someone that the author doesn't approve of. I mean, that happens, you know, not just with Pride and Prejudice or whatever, but even with All in the Family. You know, I mean, Norman Lear created that character, Archie Bunker, to like make fun of white racists. And, you know, I mean, nobody really approves of Archie's attitude, you know, toward African Americans, but he is sympathetic in a certain way. And he became kind of a hero to a lot of people because it's really art, not just propaganda.
But that's a good point, because it does show you the multidimensionality of human beings. Also, good literature, classic literature, does not give you avatars. It does not give you a character that just has like one flat, you know, affect or personality and a set of traits. Like, this person embodies these traits, this person embodies those traits. You're seeing characters who are flawed like other human beings. And so the other thing that I like about it is, as contrasted with what they're having kids read today, if you're a teacher who wanted to teach certain character lessons and you chose a piece of literature for this purpose, it's somewhat removed from the children. You know, it's like removed from their experience. It's not, depersonalize it. It's not a polemic, you know, and you're not dictating them. You're just saying, let's talk about these characters over there that lived hundreds of years or thousands of years, whatever, and get the kids talking about this and let them figure out what it means to them in their life, as opposed to like telling them. And so it's part what you're saying about the propaganda, but also I think when you start learning lessons, even if it's like Lord of the Flies, for example, or something like that, it's just removed enough from their own little gang warfare in their school that they can have conversations about ganging up on people and so forth. But it's out there.
Yeah.
It's out there.
And I remember when I was teaching 7th grade language arts, the most popular book I taught every year was The Outsiders.
Yes.
Everybody loved The Outsiders, and it didn't matter what your race was, what your religion, if you were male or female, everybody loved The Outsiders. And I think there are, on so many levels, we could look at it from what those kids' lives were like when they were living them, but also really look at it from a present day. And I think there were so many themes that as a teacher you bring out that the kids can relate to, and then they want to keep reading. And so I also do think that there is some responsibility on the teacher for how they're teaching the books as well, and if they are teaching classics, they're making it relevant to kids in the sense that they're, whatever they're doing, they're drawing the kids into the book. That, yeah, I would always be amazed just how much, Mrs. Schwartz, can we read one more chapter? Can we keep going? With that book. Great. And several kids every year in my class who would fight me tooth and nail to read a book. They reading for 10 minutes in the morning, and they could read any book they wanted off the shelves. And I would have a mix of classics and not classics. And sometimes, to get a kid to read who really doesn't like reading, you might not give them a classic. You might find something that they're interested in, let them start reading, and then kind of build on that. But no matter what, even those kids, we have to keep going. What's going to happen? What's going to happen to Pony Boy? We have to keep going with The Outsiders. And so I really do think that we can keep these classics in the classroom and make them relevant, and like a fabulous experience for these kids.
The challenge is, as I'm seeing though, that they're not even having kids read the same book at the same time.
Right.
And so I wanted to get back to Elizabeth. You mentioned before the show started that you witnessed some things when you were at UNC Chapel Hill, and that has informed your point of view as far as why this is happening. Can you share that with us?
Oh, absolutely. So I was in graduate school in the mid 80s in Carolina and Chapel Hill, and I taught freshman English with a bunch of English graduate students. And what was going on in the Department of English as a graduate program was that, that was the days of Jesse Jackson marching, I guess on the Stanford campus. Hey, hey, ho, ho, Western Civ has got to go. Right. So that was the big attack on the canon. And it was basically the study of literature was being replaced with what they called theory at the time, which is the same thing as critical blank theory. Sometimes it's race theory, sometimes it's class theory, sometimes it's gender theory, but basically it's all Marxism. So it was being replaced with Marxism, feminism, and deconstruction. I don't know if you remember that, but anyway, kind of a philosophy that turns out to have been influenced in a bizarre way by ex-Nazis. But anyway, so these are, I would call these all like sterile and nefarious ideologies. I mean, they're just not based in truth. And if you look at what Marxism has done to the world, it's a pretty ugly picture, and you can, while, I'm not saying women haven't suffered at the hands of men in world history, but the kind of feminism that's like, men are always our enemies and we should have a chip on our shoulder and that it's not making anyone happy. Right.
Right.
So, and one use of classic literature is, I am the most anti-feminist person ever, really. And, but when I'm still surprised, like I reread the Symposium, Plato's Symposium a few years ago, and I was like, oh, they got me, look, there's this character, Diotima, a female character. Like, I know that it's not true that women were all slaves before, the suffragist movement, but I find myself like forgetting how engaged and educated and sophisticated women were known to be centuries ago. If you read I looked at 1001 Nights, the Arabian Nights, which was translated into French in the 18th century, and it was written in Persia before that. And Scheherazade is like educated in math and astronomy and geography and medicine. And I'm like, oh, yeah, I forgot women actually did sometimes get educated,
Right.
you know, in those olden times. Anyway, so basically these ideologies, which are, I think, making a lot of people miserable today and causing a lot of problems, were replacing the study of classic literature, which was being said was said to be just dead white males, right? At all.
Right. It's
And somehow the patriarchy, right? And at the same time, I was teaching, I mean, it was the graduate students who were really agitating for this change. And the same graduate students were teaching freshman English with me. We were all teaching freshman English, and we all had our office in this one big room where the students would come work on their grammar with us or whatever. And I'd overhear and talk to the other grad students and see what they were up to. And I would say the vast majority of them considered it to be their mission to detach the college freshmen from the values that they had learned from their parents, you know, from their evangelical Christianity, from their conservative politics, from their traditional morality. So, I mean, they were just on a, you know, a lot of people in the world get their identity from being more sophisticated than those rubes I grew up with, right? They were at Chapel Hill, the flagship university. They had gotten over being an evangelical Christian from some small town in North Carolina, and they were going to share that experience with and give it to other people. And, right, you know, the classics were not helpful for that.
Yeah.
Exactly. I do think it's intentional. I think it's, you know, it is certainly a great way to separate us from that common humanity and make sure that their other efforts to divide us will be more effective. But I have another theory. So I think that it's definitely intentional as far as the destruction of Western civilization and all that. I also think there is a component of it that has now become, because of other influences, like the failure to teach reading. And Beanie, I think you can speak to this. The failure to teach reading using the science of reading has resulted in kids who can't read. It's not just that they won't or don't, or we're not giving them good books, but I experienced myself this past summer. What happens when you, a well-meaning teacher, try to use a good book with students, even chosen at their adjusted grade level. So in other words, these were 6th and 7th graders. I adjusted down and picked a 4th grade book, but I picked one that was an adventure story. It was, you know, I would call it a classic. It's called Gregor the Overlander, but it's quality, children's literature. And I chose it because I thought it was short enough and easy enough for them to read, but at the same time would do what we wanted to do in terms of teaching grammar and teaching writing and all the things I had to do in a summer class. I bought the book for all the kids. I crowdfunded it.
Oh, wow.
And I went and dropped it off at a church in their neighborhood so they could go pick it up. I even offered to bring it door to door, but they didn't. They said, no, drop it off. We'll pick it up. And
my teacher's stalking me.
Yeah, no, I just said, I wanted to make it easy. I didn't want anyone to have the excuse of like, we can't buy the book, we don't have the money. So went through all of that and went through a whole week of class, and only 2 kids out of 2 sections, so 2 kids out of maybe 12 got the book. And after that first week, and they weren't paying attention, they did, why are we doing a book? Can't we do passages? Why are we reading a book? Then I got a complaint from the woman who hired me. And mind you, they weren't paying for the class. This was free. Okay. So the woman came to me and said, we've got a complaint that this book is about magic and it conflicts with their religious beliefs. These are public school kids. And I said, okay, there's no magic in it. There's science. There's definitely science and adventure, but there's zero mystical, magical, nothing. There's nothing in there. Okay. And she's, oh, I guess I better look at this book you picked. I'm like, you hired me and I gave you my entire lesson plan for the whole summer. She hadn't even looked at it. And then the parents were saying things like, well, why can't they? And why can't this? So she finally got down to it. The point is, you can't continue with the book. You need to switch and just use these online passages and just go back to what they're able to do. And I was so frustrated with this and decided I wouldn't do it. So I quit because, but
so it was really about the difficulty. They just didn't want to have to read a book.
they didn't want to have to read a book. And as I said, there were 6th and 7th graders who I was told were probably reading at 4th grade level. So I chose a book that wouldn't make them feel like babies. In other words, it wasn't a picture book, but it was leveled there. It was leveled at, 4th through 7th because it was so interesting. The kids in 7th grade will read it because it's fun, right? So I thought, okay, I'll do this. And I went painfully slowly. Like I started off, I even read to them, you guys. The first week I read
that's
to
going
them.
on. I mean, my husband teaches school, and it's that you have to, I mean, they get the kids to the point where they can really read the classics in high school at his tiny little Catholic boys' school. But you have to start by going around the class and having them read passages out loud, because otherwise you don't know if they can read,
Right. And this is the problem. They won't pick up the book because their parents don't even see the value in reading a book, period.
So
like, why are they reading a book in English class was the question.
I remember.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I remember, and it was at the high school level, but when I was getting my master's degree at UNC Charlotte, and I had to do clinical observation hours, I was observing at a high school in Charlotte. And I believe it was an 11th grade honors class or an 11th grade regular class. And they were reading they were reading not the whole Crucible, but parts. So they had their big textbook and they were reading bits and pieces of the Crucible, but not the whole thing, just passages. And I stayed after to ask the teacher about it because I was shocked that what they were basically doing were reading little passages, and they would be given quizzes, dates from the book, basically memorization stuff. And I feel like, so that was even spilling over into high school. And this was, this could be this could be about 10 years ago. And I was so floored by the fact that, and she was too, she was new. She had come here, I want to say from Vermont. And she was not happy with the fact that she couldn't teach full novels. And one of the other reasons they couldn't teach full novels, and I can't speak to the way their schedule is now, but unless you had AP English, you were given English one semester a year. So English was half the year. So let's say you were in 10th grade and you had English the first semester, the first half of the year, and then you had it in 11th grade the second half of the year. You've now got a full year without taking an English class. And on top of that, because it's just one semester long, they're not reading novels and fiction and books like this because there isn't enough time, right? And so they really,
that's what they did in my daughter. She went to Myers Park High School for 1 year, and her the whole first semester, she did not have a core class. She did not have history. She did not have English. She did not have foreign language. She did not have math. It was like PE and some, earth science and some art class or other. And they picked her schedule. She didn't. She registered for all those classes, and we thought it would be 2 semesters, but they have these 90-minute classes, and they just pack it into one semester, and that's it. They had one chance to read a whole book in the whole semester in honors English. And the teacher gave him a book list that was like the library list of dystopian literature. Okay. And she looked at it and she said, well, the ones that are decent, I don't want to read. I've already read them. The rest are garbage. So she went to the teacher and she said, can I read, what was it? The Count of Monte Cristo. She wanted to read the Count of Monte Cristo.
Favorite.
And the teacher said, why? Like, it's a 1,000-page book. Why are you reading this book? She said, because I want to. And she said, well, if you think you can do it, whatever. So of course she did it because she's a proficient, reader, and she read it and she wrote her paper. And the teacher was like, if I could have 20 more students like this, whatever. But nobody else even finished their books.
My daughter was a freshman last year at the #1 high school in our state, and she was in advanced English. And instead of reading books, she was given a 33-page packet of garbage, basically. I mean, when I looked at it, that was what got me into no left turn in education a little bit. She read one book the whole entire year, Animal Farm. It's the only book that they read. This is the #1 high school in the state.
It's a good book, though. At least it's a good book.
English. My son was a senior. He was in honors English. But he was allowed to choose his 2 books. And I don't even remember what his first book was that he read, but the second one, I helped him choose one that I thought he might like. All Quiet on the Western Front was what he chose. And when he took it to his teacher, she said, that's really old. Why don't you read a newer book? And I'm like, so here's
translation. I've never read it, and I don't know
it's,
what it's about.
but it's 2021. Okay, I graduated from college in 1997 from the education department. 1997. It was kind of starting at that point in time. We have a generation of new teachers coming in now,
Right.
or there now, who did not develop that endurance for reading books, classics. They did not develop the ability to read them and then to analyze them and think about them. When they were in their teacher training, educate wherever they went, they were probably taught more about child development and the age appropriate, all this other kind of stuff, that they weren't taught how to teach kids how to read, how to teach young students how to read and analyze passages or books or anything like that. So everything's excerpts. I mean, I would venture to say that some of these teachers don't teach these classics because they haven't read them themselves and couldn't read them themselves. Right. So, that's not across the board. I do know some wonderful English teachers who could, read anything you put in front of them. But I think that there's some out there who really, I've seen libs of TikTok. There's some out there who can't read these books and understand them. So
I was going to say,
that's our problem, that, we're not bringing in the best and the brightest to teach our kids to.
Well, I also feel like the generation of kids who are now coming up as adults, probably, and, coming out of college and coming out of grad school, and depending on what their, values and ideologies are, they're bringing that with them to the classroom. And so I think you combine that with the fact that, right, they were not taught this STEM. And I majored in English for, I was an English major at Tufts University. And when I went and got my master's at UNC, I even had to take extra English classes to fill in what I was missing, which was honestly a treat for me because it had been a while since I got to, do things like that. But I think it's a combination of, right, your daughter's teacher at Myers Park who said, I wish I had 24 of you. But at the same time, you didn't encourage her. You didn't even encourage her to read the book when she brought you the book, right? You were like, well, why?
Right.
So I do think that there is that issue of why would you want to read these classics? Plus they're long and hard.
Well, and I knew,
right.
Actually the high school I graduated from, I was working with a group of girls who were in AP Junior English. It was last year, and they didn't read a single book. This is AP Junior English. So these are the best and the brightest in the school. They did not read one single book all year. And when I inquired about it, of course, they weren't my kids. They're just, happened when I inquired about it, they said, well, they're probably preparing them for the tests. And there's a lot of writing in the test. And I'm like, this is the cream of the crop. You could probably teach them to write and they could read at the same time. I mean,
think we can multitask there.
So,
plus they go together, like you said.
Yeah, but,
right.
but part of the problem really is this influx of, we got to hurry up and get all of our college courses in while we're still in high school. It's not about learning. It's about, the ACT score, the SAT score,
getting to the next
scores and all that.
Step on the ladder
along the line, we've lost that mindset of, we actually go to school to cultivate this love of learning and to teach our kids to seek beauty and knowledge and understanding well after graduation. Like that should be not just going to job. I mean, that's part of it, but there's more to it than going to, than just doing that.
The other thing is that, I hire and manage copy editors, right? And which involves some rewriting of things that authors need reworded for them or whatever. And it also involves, in fact, you can't write well if you're not a reader because you don't know what writing is supposed to sound like.
Right.
Exactly.
It's so true.
And I writing myself, and I see kids, and the other thing the teachers are doing with the writing is they are giving them formulas so that they're making it like fill in the blanks. Your first paragraph must have 3 examples, and they all have to tie back to your topic sentence, and your topic sentence must have a minimum of this many words, and it's just. They're not learning how to write well because the teacher's putting so many parameters around what the writing should look like rather than, structurally, rather than whether it conveys what it's supposed to convey. And so I'm trying to work with my tutoring students on the part they're not being taught, which is, what is it that you're trying to say? What is your point? And the kids are so tied up in knots because they'll say, but if I do it your way, the teacher's going to be mad and I'm going to fail. And I said, I promise you, if you do it my way, the teacher's not going to be mad at you. The teacher's doing it their way because they don't. Well, if they are, then I will give the teacher a piece of their mind.
I was a reading interventionist, and I would help kids write their paragraphs, and they would have completed their thought, but they were like, well, I have to write one more sentence because it has to have 4 sentences, and I'm like, but there's nothing else to say here. Like, you've said everything in that paragraph, but they did. They had to, because we counted sentences. It wasn't about.
I'd take that teacher on. Give me that phone number. I'll call that teacher.
Okay, here's what I think is extremely ironic. Okay, so these modern education people, they took all the memorization out of school. Like, you used to have to memorize poetry, you used to have to memorize your times tables, you used to have to memorize all this fascinating content, right? And now they make, and it was supposed to, we were switching to critical thinking or something, right? And we didn't have to, memorization was so old fashioned. Now you have to memorize the teacher's formula for writing an essay, and the explanation of the Common Core math. Rather, you don't learn the times tables. Instead, you memorize the steps to go through to do some eccentric thing it's crazy. We should go back to memorizing the actual, if they're going to memorize stuff, and they should, let them learn the content that, like, if you memorize a poem, that's like a valuable thing in your head. It's like having, you have a Shakespeare sonnet in your head. It's like having a work of art there for the rest of your life.
I do believe there's a shift. So I follow the classic learning text group, and there's a lot of, and even I just remarked on Twitter this morning that this influx of people who appreciate and are trying to spread their love and appreciation of classical learning in general. So, and I do think that there's a shift back to that. It's going to be slow, but but I think people are seeing the value in it. And
let's hope we can turn it into a fashion trend, like how retro things like Airstreams and homesteading and, like all the stuff that just suddenly became like, oh, have you heard you can bake your own bread? And we're also, and those of us who've been doing it, they're like, you can.
But now the teachers unions will never support this. So it does not go, because,
but maybe more parents will do it on their own. So.
I was going to say,
they kind of reveal that they don't care about even going to school or educating. So people are seeking out alternatives.
Yes,
I was
and that's a beautiful thing.
Right. I went to public school my whole life, and then 10th, 11th, and 12th, I went to a private high school in New York. My grandma sent me, and I have to say the difference, and I don't say that to be like, oh, I went to private school, but the English classes, and I actually the history and social studies classes too, and they were often co-taught in many ways. The amount of exposure that I had there to classics, to works of art, I remember having to memorize a whole soliloquy from Macbeth that I probably could recite most of it still, and things like that. It really changed my life, and it changed in the sense of how to think. I really don't think I fully knew or appreciated how to think critically and analytically until I got to that school. I don't think I would have gotten into Tufts had I not gone to that school. And I really, really think that it's because of the literature that was taught and the way it was taught. And we read every year, there was a different Shakespeare book. I mean, there was The Great Gatsby, and there was Melville, and there was Hemingway, and I didn't like all the books, but sitting there having those discussions, whether it was in history class or English class, I really think made a difference in being able to be a writer, whether it's creatively or writing an article about something, and also just being able to think for yourself and think outside the box. And we're really, they're in the box, they really
I had this
same box.
Jen, I had this same experience. I was in public school through 9th grade, and then did 10th, 11th, and 12th in a private prep school. And I remember I was a mediocre student. I did okay in English and I did okay in history because I sort of just had natural, ability in those areas, verbal skills. But when I got to private school, I had the same experience in my first English class. I thought, like, this is awesome. Like, where's this been all my life? Right. And we had electives we could take. So I took every single English class elective that you could take and like cram into my schedule. I had classes like The Bad Seed, Evil in Literature, and I had Fantasy and Dreams, reading, these, like all the stuff, those kind of books. And, I just gobbled it up as much as I could possibly get. And but I missed out on those middle school books, things like The Outsiders, things like that. So when my kids were coming up, I went back and I'm like, oh, this is my chance now to go back and read like the middle school books that I missed out on because I was jumping straight into the Shakespeare. And I really feel bad for kids today. They are, above and beyond all the lessons we want them to learn, the critical thinking skills, the rhetorical skills, and all the writing skills. They're just plain missing out on cultural knowledge. I can watch, certain movies, even cartoons, even Bugs Bunny. I can go to an art museum. I can go to plays. I can do things. And the reason I appreciate them and understand what's going on is that I've read a lot of these books, not every single one of them, but enough of them that there's sort of a cultural knowledge, background knowledge, that
and
things have more, history. Like you said, all of it has more meaning because of what I read.
Okay, I would like to make an argument that this is another, and in fact, maybe the crucial reason that abolishing the classics creates leftism, political leftism in people. Okay, so this is what we sent our kid to an ordinary Catholic school until he was in second grade, and we became very dissatisfied with it, and actually they also became dissatisfied with our kid and wanted him on Ritalin, which we were not on board with. So, we were looking for another school, partly for that reason, but partly because it was a Catholic school, but I never heard anything about the saints. It was always some person, a woman or a person of color who had whose heroic act was standing up to the patriarchy or the racism, right? And like Frida Kahlo, I don't know if you know who she is, but she's an artist, but like a Marxist. Like she claimed to have played some role in Stalin's assassination of Trotsky. I mean, this is not Mother Teresa here, right?
Right.
So why were they holding up these figures as the ones for my child to admire? And really almost worse, what was the only action that was admirable was to stand up to discrimination, right? Which, I mean, it could be an admirable action, but it's not the only virtue. I mean, you also have to be brave and kind and loving. And, there's other things that are required in life. And I mean, basically my kid would get in the car after school and say, did you know women didn't used to be allowed to wear pants? Like the entire story of all world history that he was getting was people were discriminated against in the past. And I, a third grader, immediately know better than every person in world history up until the 1950s, right? Like there's just this obvious thing that I intuitively understand that everybody was wrong about until now. And that was the only thing that ever happened in history. So, I was like, how is he, like, this is an inoculation against ever learning anything.
Yep.
Because
exactly.
He's going to dismiss everything that happened before Jackie Robinson as evil. And he's going to think that the only thing we need to do to solve it is just like snap our fingers and be woke third graders. And
dismantle Western society.
I think that's what happened. I think that's what happened is that young people think that everything until the day before yesterday was just evil that anybody should have seen through. And that if they just snapped their fingers, everything would be perfect. And that the only problem with the world is the evil old fashioned people who don't get it.
And I think that view also, it's almost, and again, by not teaching the classes, you're getting rid of the ideas of respect and manners and civility within all this, right? So, those young kids who think that everything is evil, and before that, it's also what they think about how you stand up to that, or what you do with those things. I feel like, eliminating the classics, eliminating these themes and analytical and creative thinking, and being able to discuss, challenging books and, all the like.
Okay, so I just lost
there's such a lack of respect and
Yeah, I
manners and
can't hear
civility
you
with
anymore.
kids.
Can you hear us, Elizabeth? Can you hear us?
We can hear you.
Yeah.
We can hear you. Can you hear us? I don't know if she can hear us.
I don't think so.
Well, what I want to do is, since we're coming up on an hour, I want to turn the conversation towards what can we do? Like, aside from having conversations like this and just alerting parents to the fact that their kids are not learning, literature, they're not reading books. Maybe parents haven't noticed. I've spoken to so many parents like, I thought they kept the books at school. Maybe I hadn't seen any books coming home, whatever. It's like, no, they're not reading them. So, what can we do? Is there anything we can do to try to get pushed back on this and get the classics back into school? Or were we basically dealing with the option of, I of course am a big proponent of alternative options, right? Fund the kids, not the schools. Yeah. But for those parents who, for whatever reason, are not ready to make that leap, what can we do?
Well, so I think I've shared with you a couple of my speeches that I've given to the board, and I've written letters similar and to the legislators and stuff too. And I think, we really do need to go all the way back to the science of reading, that initial stage of teaching kids to read, because if they don't grasp that initial being able to read just the basics, preschool, kindergarten through third grade, they're learning to read. Fourth grade on, they're reading to learn. So we've all heard that. Okay. But if you don't get that initial step down, well, then you can't bump them up to other things. So one of the things that I've done to combat a little bit of this is just to bring out the literacy.
I can't hear you all anymore. I don't know if you can hear me, but I've tried everything on my computer, and I'm going to just bow out. It's been a great conversation, but I think my computer is dying or something. Thank you so much for inviting me on. It was a wonderful discussion. Bye-bye.
Thank you for coming. Okay, sorry.
So,
it happens.
I brought up the literacy rates, and actually, I pulled up the NAEP scores just all across the country just today when I'm going over some things, and we can look at our literacy rate across the country and how it has really declined. I mean, we've done, brought in the whole language. We're bringing in all of these culturally responsive teaching methods and the culturally relevant literature and all that kind of stuff. It's not working. I mean, we are declining in our literacy rates. And so I think, I try to, when I'm making this argument, sort of really go with facts and data that what has been happening for the last 2 decades is not working. We're actually either stagnating or going backwards in most cases. In my district, we actually went backwards. So kind of going back to that and then you go back to, again, bringing out what are the important lessons that can be taught here. And let's think about that. I had one parent comment, I hate to read. I try to get my kids to read. They hate to read, but these were their SAT scores and these were their ACT scores. And they were great. And this kid's probably going to get into a great college because of their test scores. And we almost sort of change the mindset of parents that your kid is more than a test score. Your kid is more than a grade. Your kid's more than a report card.
And they can dumb down the tests so that the test score looks great.
I mean, when these kids learn how to take tests from kindergarten through 12th grade, by the time they get to that ACT, they know how to take a test for the most part, So, sort of changing that mindset. And I think that you hit the nail on the head that, for those parents who are really interested in cultivating this love of learning and cultivating a love of beauty and knowledge and understanding, fund the students, not the systems. Let those parents choose a classical education for their child, whether it be secular or Christian or whatever it is. Let them choose that. And the parents who really just want that test score, who just really want their kid to get the right ACT score so that they can get out there on that corporate ladder, then have at it, but fund the students, not the systems. And then parents have a choice. And we'll see who goes further, because we know what our founders studied classicals.
Right. And I've heard so many excuses that are so ironic too. Like, for example, I don't understand why every school in America doesn't have a standard policy that you may not have a cell phone in the classroom, period. And then the second policy is we have got to get these kids off of the one-to-one computing systems like the Chromebooks. We've got to stop. There's so much data to support what I'm about to say, which is that reading on a computer when you're not already a proficient reader, like you're an adult and okay, when you are reading on a computer to learn, it is not going to work. It is ineffective, too many distractions. You are literally creating ADD in these children, and we've got to get them off these
last
Chromebooks.
week that supported that
Oh,
even
yeah.
with adults, though, that said that even reading on a screen of any kind, not just a
No,
computer,
you're right.
but a
We
screen of any
don't
kind,
retain it. We
it's not
don't
the
retain it.
deeper reading. Yeah,
We don't retain it. You do better to do audiobooks
you do,
than to
right?
read on a screen.
You do.
And so, not that I'm encouraging audiobooks for the children. I'm just saying that we've got to go back. I hate to say it, we've got to go back to the old-fashioned ways of paper and pencil and paper books, and get rid of the cell phones in the classroom. And what's so funny to me is the excuse I always hear from the teachers or the schools that have these, well, they're allowed to have their cell phones, is, well, the parents want it, whatever. These are the same schools who say parents don't know what's best. Parents are dumb.
Right.
We have to do this. We have to do that. Parents
Can't
shouldn't
have
be
it both
educating their own
ways.
kids. Well, the parents want it. So
I was going to say, I feel like it is an uphill battle, and it's such a layered issue because yes, we have to go back to the basics, but right. Also you have parents and in the home. And I grew up, I was an avid reader. And I mean things like the Bobbsey twins and Nancy Drew, to start, but I saw my parents reading books, and my grandma could finish
that's a big factor,
huge novel, in a day. And, at home, my son is 8, but we read books every night. We read to him, and now he's reading, and he has to read 15 minutes every day for school. But reading is we emphasize it, right? And so you have the parent aspect. Then I think you have the teacher aspect. When I taught 7th grade, one of my superpowers was getting kids who didn't like to read reading. And it wasn't that, I think you have to kind of know how to do that and know the balance, right? So we read tons of classics, but when you came into my classroom in the morning, you had to read for 10 minutes silently, and it could be any book you wanted. And, for a girl who didn't like to read, I might give them a book that's, not that great, like a Pretty Little Liars or, whatever it is. But The Hunger Games was really popular back then, but these kids started reading and they started liking it. And then I was able to say, okay, well, now we're going to read The Giver. Now we're going to read The Outsiders. Now we're going to read To Kill a Mockingbird. And I think, so there's the educator piece also, right? And then who's educating the educators?
right.
So it is, there's a whole, so yeah. So the idea of choosing, what the right thing is for your child, and being in, and that's the other thing, we're all very clearly involved in what our kids are learning. We're, we, for our kids who are in school, we are very up on what's being taught, what they're bringing home. Not all parents do that. And I also think too, the screens, the technology
is a killer.
It really is. I mean, it's, again, I really think that's why it's the most uphill battle, because the kids also, who wants to sit and read a classic when they have screens that are going at their brains like this, right? It rewires their brains. They can't sit, they can't concentrate. It's always about the next best thing, what's right now, the impulsivity. And that's, I think, making it's making it really difficult when it comes to reading and in the classroom. And that's not even just reading the classics, that's even just reading.
But it's just so funny that
learning to read.
But these so-called educators take the position that because not all the parents are going to be like what we're trying to do for our kids, then they have to make things go down instead of scaffolding up, instead of going back, as you said, Beanie, and saying like, okay, well, let's go back to the science of reading. We know it works. And the, look-say method works for, deaf kids and, kids with 130 IQ, but it doesn't really work for like the average person. So let's go back to what does work. I mean, if that's your argument that, well, average kids and below average kids and kids with families that are dysfunctional, though they can't do da-da-da. And it's like, okay, then that's your mission. Your mission school is to provide that, because then you can really argue that the other kids are going to be, quote, okay. Instead, what you've done is you've said the gifted kids, the kids with parents who care, they're going to be okay. And you're just, while you dumb everything down for everybody else. What?
Right. Those kids get bored. Those kids need enrichment. I mean, learn how to scaffold your teaching, learn how to do literature circles, right? Learn how to target the kids who are lower level, but provide enrichment to the kids who need more.
So
they're not exactly helping them. They're selling them short.
Yeah. My daughter was in a gifted and talented school for middle school. And I kind of laugh about it because it really wasn't at all. But she was a very quick reader. I mean, she would get a chapter book. She'd be done in 2 days, and the rest of the class is just reading the first chapter or whatever. And we battled this all along, but we had some really great teachers who were better at it than others. But their answer to these gifted kids is not to give them more challenging work or enriching work. It's just to give them more work. It's
Right.
like, okay, more work isn't the same thing as work that's going to challenge them, or, give them a harder book, or, I think she was reading Tangerine. That was the only book that she read that one year.
I used to do that for my summer reading. That was always one of the summer reading options.
Yeah. I mean, it was, it's just like, okay, fine, but don't just giving them an extra book report to write, or, something like
Right.
that. That's not the same thing as challenging them and making sure that, I mean, you wouldn't, I don't know. That was a very frustrating thing. Every year at the end of the year when they would do the surveys, for what are your complaints? My complaint is you don't do anything for the kids who need to be challenged.
It's so true.
I would kids who need extra help, that you don't do anything to challenge the kids. But the school that I volunteer in, it's so they're in K through 12, and they've been in public schools all this time. There's actually one 6-year-old who's never been inside a school because he would have been there during COVID and we were shut down. So he's never set foot inside a school. But some of these other, like the 17-year-olds, have been in public schools the whole time. And it's amazing how far behind they are in some of their basic skills, and how quickly they're catching up, and how hungry they are for this knowledge, for these skills, for this. And it's hard stuff. I mean, we're going through the Declaration of Independence. We're reading books. Pastor, who's the principal of this school, he believes in a very rigorous curriculum, and their writing, he doesn't hold back with that. He had them reflect on Pilgrim's Progress last week, and they're writing about the War of 1812 and all this kind of stuff. But and they have the ideas up there, but they just don't have the skills to get them out, and they want to know how to do that. They really want to know. And so I think that we deprive these students of this opportunity, and we, I don't know, we almost like belittle them by thinking they can't handle it. They just can't handle it. It's like, all we've heard is how resilient kids are. Okay. For the last 2 years, it's like, kids are resilient. Kids are resilient. You know what? Kids want to learn. I mean, in that terms, if something's hard, they might buck it at first, but then once they start actually being successful, they'll see, you know what, this is actually pretty good. And I'm proud of myself because I tried and I conquered and I did it. Jeremy Wayne Tate, who does the classic learning test, his son was doing handwriting at the beginning of this year, and he hated it. And he would share stories about his son crying, and it would be awful. And he showed a picture of it, and it was kind of, I think it was 2nd grade. I'm not really sure. And then he just showed the 3-month progress, and it's beautiful. I mean, the difference is beautiful. And you know what? His son is very proud of himself. Nobody did that for him. Nobody said, you know what, we know it's really hard, so it doesn't have to be that neat. No, the teacher said it has to be that neat. It just does.
And that's a life skill,
because he can do it, and it's beautiful. And he appreciates that's what is. So I think that we need to stop treating students today like they can't do hard things that students 30, 40, 50 years ago could do, because they can, and they should.
Or like they don't have to because Grammarly.
Right. Right. Well, I mean, you have to remember, this is a generation. Some of these kids wore knee pads and helmets when they were learning to crawl so that they didn't hurt their knees and bump their heads. So
I mean, I always think about when I was teaching 7th grade, and we would have I would assign vocab words, and I had dictionaries in my classroom. And if there was time, I would let them start. And the amount of kids who didn't know how to use an actual paper dictionary because they're just used to going online and typing the word in, at dictionary.com. It blew my mind.
And the school that I volunteer at, the very first time I ever went in, I walked into the classroom. There's not a screen in sight in this building, the church where it's housed. There's not a screen in sight. Well, they have TVs, but they don't use screens. But the first time I ever walked in just to meet the kids and the pastor and see what this was all about, they were looking up their vocabulary words in a paper dictionary, and I almost cried.
Right.
I would cry.
I want to be
I
part
know.
of it.
There's something to be said for
was
that.
beautiful. And everything they do is on, paper and pencil. Their books are they're paper and pencil. And it's,
I love that.
So,
I mean,
yeah.
even my 8-year-old, who also he's has OT and struggled with reading and writing for a while, and he's doing great now. We always say things to him like, "Aren't you so proud of you?" And I know it sounds so cheesy, or "You worked so hard for that. Aren't you so proud of you?" Or "Are you proud of that work? Are you sure that's what you want to get, bring to your teacher," type of thing? Because I think it's really teaching them that, okay, this is hard. I might have had to work a little extra harder than the other 2 boys at my table.
Yeah.
But I did it, and now I'm doing better. And again,
It's the
these
same
kids
thing
are going to be
reading the
adults
books.
one day. Right, exactly.
It's when you read these books, as you pointed out, you don't like all the books. I mean, I remember hearing, Moby Dick is the greatest American novel ever written, blah, 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 right? I barely got through that book. I mean, I read it, but it just was not my jam. Okay.
Catcher in the Rye too. I couldn't. I know that's going to sound controversial. Like we
don't all have to like them, but we can appreciate what they are.
I wanted to love it so much, and I don't know. I didn't fall in love with it the way that other people do. But
my son was a soccer player. My one son was a soccer player, and I took him to a tournament one weekend up in Ohio or something like that. And they played the one game, and it wasn't a good game. They really didn't play a good game. They lost. And he came off the field, and I was like, "Good job. Good game." And he said, and he was a teenager at the time. And he said, "I really wish you wouldn't tell me that when it wasn't." It's like, it kind of negates it when it is. It was like, okay, I'll never tell you that again. But that's coming from a teenage boy that don't tell me that I just did something good when it wasn't really that good. It's like when my kid brings home an A, and I'll say, "Oh, that's great. Did you study hard for that test?" "Not really." Well, okay, well, you got lucky. I mean, I'm not going to tell them "Good job, way to work," because they didn't work.
That's an important point that you're making, is that has consequences, as I just learned this past weekend. Kids know when things are just full of garbage, when the teachers are full of crap,
so
when the A doesn't really matter. They know. And this idea that they don't know, and that they're simultaneously so brilliant they should tell their parents to go blow it out their ear when it comes to their values, is hilarious to me. But they know it's not real, and that makes them feel incredibly insecure, because they also know that school is like the only place they're gonna go. They spend 8 hours a day or whatever that's where they're supposed to learn all the stuff that's going to help them be an adult. And at the same time, they know that you're basically BSing them, that they're learning it, and they're phoning it in, and they like deep down know the rest of the world is not going to coddle them forever. And it's terrifying. We are making the process of growing up terrifying on so many levels. First, by not giving them access to classic literature that gives them access to themes that challenge them, push them, scare them a little bit, but also inspire them and show them heroes overcoming, people triumphing over great deals of adversity they couldn't possibly appreciate, showing them progress and how progress comes from hard work and perseverance and high quality. We're not giving them that. Then we're not asking them to do any of it. And at the same time, we're going, you're so brilliant. Here's your A, here's your honors, here's your trophies, here's your this. And these kids, this creates a kind of hole that like they know it's not real. And where do they go to deal with that anxiety? They're going to devices. They're not going to people, because what else are they not learning when they don't read literature? Communication skills. You think you could teach communication skills.
How to talk to each other, right?
But you can't. You're reading dialogue. You're reading interactions. You're reading about dating. You're reading about courtship. You're reading about relationships that go bad. You're reading about friendships, betrayal, revenge, all the things. And you say, "Oh, that didn't work out well," or "Wait, that was a better way to do it." Okay, so I'd rather they put them in front of classical movies. If they're not going to have them read the books, at least you might get some decent dialogue and understand some social skills. But they need modeling. You cannot directly instruct this. So they turn to a device. They get lost in a device, not actual humans. And that's not where anything good happens.
There's a favorite quote by C.S. Lewis that kind of speaks to this, and I'm sure you've all have heard it. "Since it is so likely that children will meet cruel enemies, let them at least have heard of brave knights and heroic courage. Otherwise, you are making their destiny not brighter, but darker." And I just love that. Like, I feel like I want to post
Nails
that
it.
every day just to remind
Yes.
people of, like, we're not
Because,
doing them
right.
any favors by
Because they're going to be adult.
them.
Then they're going to grow into adults and they inherit the future of this country. And how's that going to work out for all of us when they can't?
Well, I mean, that's why perpetual adolescence is the pandemic of our day. I mean,
Right.
really,
Very true.
we have a lot of people who
Advocate for my issue now. You're so mean. Gosh.
Right. I'm so oppressed. You have no idea what oppression looks like.
Just that point alone, it's like, I would have some of these girls sit down and read Sister Carrie. I would have them read some of these books and be like, you have it bad, do you?
Right.
Like, I mean, geez, even Oliver freaking Twist, it's like, I grew up in an abusive household. Did you? Okay, let's have a chat. And I'm sorry, I don't mean to belittle it. That's not to say that their issues are, but we have changed the definition of so many words that kids who live upper middle class lifestyles are calling themselves oppressed because mom asked them to clean their room.
But reading a story about a person that like Oliver Twist, far removed from today's contemporary society, who, people who really are going through abusive situations can learn from that as well. So it's not, and I think that, like you mentioned earlier, that sometimes when we have those stories that are contemporary, they're too close to home. I mean, we had a book read in our school district last year to third graders. Something happened in our town. Something did happen in our town. I'm in Louisville, Kentucky. Something happened and it was really close to home. And there were raw wounds and there were raw emotions. That was too close to home. Now, there probably were classics or older stories that could have covered the same themes and talked about some of the same situations that wouldn't have been so raw. And that, that would have been a better. So the more people change, the more they stay the same. We can go back and read those classics and see ourselves in them. We can see our society in them. We can see how things have changed and progressed and how things have maybe regressed. And so I think that we don't negate how bad some people have it today, or demean that in any way, shape, or form, but we can show them those people survived and conquered and slayed their dragons,
And you learn gratitude too.
Oh yeah, that's missing from our society.
It's missing very much.
Gratitude and respect.
Yeah.
Yep, I've read stories about whether it's Sister Carrie, even just reading the poetry of Emily Dickinson, and reading things and just being like, I am just so grateful that I don't have to live in a world that she lived in. And if you think about somebody who is extraordinarily bright, who is very sensitive, highly sensitive, doesn't want the traditional roles of things, just wants to, do her art, whatever. And it just wasn't very where she was and where she was living and who her family was. That just wasn't an option. Right. And you end up being very depressed and feeling invisible and those kinds of things. And reading these poems, I'm just thinking, God, I am so lucky. I'm so lucky to be living when I'm living, where I have so many more options available to me. I would perceive my options. I don't feel myself oppressed. I feel the options that I have, and I'm grateful for them. And I think that is absent any opportunity to learn, not by direct instruction. You should be grateful, because then we parents are left holding that bag. So we want to teach character, but 8 hours a day are taken up by the school doing the propagandizing and this socializing their way. And then our kids come home and we can't say to the kid, on top of everything else they've been through, hey, let's sit down and read this literature together. They're like, Mom, are you serious? I'm exhausted, or I don't even read well.
Exhausted.
All you can do is go, you don't do this or do this. And all that's going to do is turn them off more. So how do we even teach character? And of course, I know a lot of people out there would say, well, that's kind of by design, Deb. They don't want you to. So,
Well, because there's a balance. I mean, I taught The Outsiders, but then there are wonderful books that maybe aren't considered classics, but you want to make sure with the, you're incorporating classics and just rich stories with rich characters. I mean, some of the ones I taught, Esperanza Rising and Bronx Masquerade and Hope Was Here. These are books with really just rich stories and rich characters that teach those themes. Tangerine was a summer reading choice. And I would also offer with it as an extra The Book Thief, just something, some kids plowed through Tangerine, needed something more challenging. So there are, there's a way to do it. There's a way to find balance and really keep these classics in the classroom.
Yeah. Yeah. I hope we can bring them back. So as to wrap up, what do you remember as being your favorite piece of classic literature that you read in school, like K-12, not all the way in college, but like in your K-12 experience? What do you remember reading and thinking, this has changed my outlook, or this was really important to me?
I feel like for me, it's a toss up. Jane Eyre was
Yeah,
one. I think that was my first one because it was the first novel I read when I switched from public to private in 10th grade. But I also just have such a love affair with To Kill a Mockingbird and The Great Gatsby.
Yes.
So it's,
A Great Gatsby is my favorite book of all time.
Mine
So.
too.
Right. So it's
That's my favorite book of all time.
And when I did my student teaching in Charlotte, and I did it at South Meck High School, I taught To Kill a Mockingbird, and my cooperating teacher was amazing, and she threw me in, and she didn't even do anything. I got to not just read, but teach the whole unit on it.
Wow.
You know, to ninth graders, and it was amazing.
That's
so
awesome.
I think it's a toss up between all three of those. I can't pick.
If you haven't read
Scarlet Letter, it was like my first experience with that society, and it
was
like,
sense.
What? I mean,
and now you're living it. Are you vaccinated? A scarlet
and and it's like the older I get, the more I appreciate different levels of that and different perspectives. It's like with anything else. I mean, the first time I read The Great Gatsby, I fell in love with it. But then when I went back and read it every other time, it was
again
different. You just peel the onion and you
right.
So yeah,
I love it because to me, I mean, it says different things to different people, but for me, it was the lesson that, if you try to make yourself into someone you're not, to impress other people, you're going to be constantly working on that project, and you're going to forget who you actually are, and you will not have an authentic relationship with anybody, and it probably will not work out well for you. I mean, things are not going to go well. And I mean, there's a lot more to the novel, obviously, but as a teenage girl reading that book in, maybe 10th grade or something, and it probably was one of the first books I read in private school too, I remember just thinking like, wow. And also I feel like it's the quintessential American story in the sense that, somebody is like rags to riches, but they can't quite get over their inferiority complex about where they came from. That's the whole country, if you think about it a little bit. And, like, we're not as good as Europe, and we're not as good as this, and I want to be better, and I want to be this, and I want to be something I'm not. And now you look on social media, and I look at my airbrushed.
There's that lack
persona.
of contentment too. I mean, the whole book is just all through and through lack of contentment.
Right.
It's going back
even
to
the wealthy, they have everything and they're miserable, right?
And
so
and with To Kill a Mockingbird, the quote by Atticus that you don't know what it's like to live in someone else's shoes and wait till you crawl on their skin and walk around for a while. I think that it's like this is someone's story, and this is how much you know about it.
Right.
And I think that it's a lesson that
it breaks my heart that they were talking about removing that book from.
Well, and they'll have them read that quote in isolation in a PowerPoint and drop all the context around it, and then teach that Atticus was a white savior with white savior complex. And of course, the kid's never going to be able to challenge that because they won't read the whole book. So they'll take, hey, this is a really good point. You must be empathetic. You need to learn empathy. Have empathy, damn it. It's like, but at the same time, you don't understand why he had empathy, why he did what he did, the kind of core principles that he had, and the people he was fighting against in his own milieu.
Right.
And I got to keep them away from me and my kids.
And how he passes it on to his kids, and and how they treat Boo, and just I mean everything. It's so
they're missing out. That's the point. The kids are being ripped.
Our kids are missing
a lot. That they don't get all of that.
They are. So, all right. So we got a Jane Eyre and To Kill a Mockingbird, and a Great Gatsby, and
Scarlet Letter,
and mine is Great Gatsby, and of course Pride and Prejudice. But I read Pride and Prejudice on my own, not in school. So
me too, as an adult, actually.
Yeah. So, I read it in those years, like teenage years, because they made me read Emma as a book for English lit in an elective class I took in high school. And I read it and I was like, I like the writing style. I didn't like the story per se. I liked the movies better than the book, but I wanted to read more of her writing style. I got all caught up in the writing and the way she said things and the humor. I loved the
Yeah.
humor, the subtle, dry humor. So then I saw that Pride and Prejudice was this like big, thick one. I'm like, yeah, that's the one. Because that's like a lot of words,
Oh,
you know?
that reminds me. I should have also, honestly, I should have said, and I did not read it in school, but The Count of Monte Cristo, when you said that your
right?
dog
Like my daughter read.
is
Yep.
legit one of my favorite books in the entire world.
Yeah.
But that came
phenomenal.
after school for me.
That's
Exactly.
funny. That's in our house. So I have 4 kids, and they're all very competitive, and so that's like the big thing. How thick was the thickest book you ever read?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So I can't thank you guys enough for doing this. This has been on my mind for a long, long time. Every time I see these lesson plans that are being posted and things like No Left Turn is finding and Parents Defending It and all these people are finding, I'm just like, it just reminds me what these kids are not getting. And then of course, if you directly come across, disrupt texts or any of their tweets or any of their stuff, I just get so upset. So I realize that the best way to fight their bad ideas is with better ideas. So I'm hoping that more people will watch this or share this with others who are, who love literature or even are just concerned about what their kids are doing. There's a lack of transparency in K-12 education today. So we really don't know enough about what goes on behind the closed doors in K-12 schools as it is. But the more we learn, the more alarming it is. And I can tell you with some degree of certainty that this is missing. The literature component, the way it was taught to us when we were kids is just, and it wasn't even that great then, is absent. It's not there. So I would encourage everybody watching to, raise your voice. And, when you go to those school board meetings, when you want to talk to superintendents and principals and people like that, even your lawmakers, science of reading and reading quality literature. And folks, classics are quality literature, not what your librarian tells you. Just saying. All right. Thank you everybody for coming.
Thank you.
The stream will be available immediately afterwards. Please consider, liking it, sharing it, and subscribing to the channel. And I will see you all next show. Thanks so much. Have a great afternoon, you guys.
Thanks. Bye.